All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our ACTR conference, Urging Threats of Domestic Extremism, Empowering Community Resilience. This session, we call it Higher Education Implications and Opportunity. This session, you will explore the manifestations and impacts of violent extremism in higher education institutions in the United States. The focus will be placed on preparing educators and their institutions to curb violent domestic extremism and hate through academic engagement, focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm sad that President Broderick is not feeling well today, who is also a panelist on our program, president of Old Dominion University. He sends his regards to the rest of the panel and all of the audience. We hope he gets better very soon and is that leaves us with distinguished panelists for our panel today. Dr. William Brandiff, and I'm sorry if I butchered your name, but William serves as the director of the START Center at the University of Maryland. We have Dr. Aaron Bruce, who is Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Art Center College of Design, and also the former Chief Diversity Officer at San Diego State University and a former colleague and great mentor. And then we have Kelsey Greenberg Young, a good friend of mine, who serves as the Education Director at ADL San Diego, Anti-Defamation San Diego. You could find full biographies about our panelists on our website in our program that was provided. So please feel free at some point to take a look at their full bio. Also, before we begin this program, I wanted to give a few remarks as I also serve as Chief Diversity Officer at San Diego State University. The national discussion on school safety is more than focused on K through 12, but it's not just as much, but it is just as much of concern to those who work and live in university across the country. Higher education institutions are not immune to incidents regarding hate and violent extremist ideologies. Statistics show that hate crimes on college campuses are rising. Mass shootings in this country have left many Americans more concerned about what higher education institutions are doing to combat hate and extremist ideology. Incidences targeting students of color and minority religious communities on college campuses continue to plague colleges and universities, and the number of incidences appears to be increasing according to many reports and research. These episodes are on the rise. White supremacist literature are increasing at colleges and universities. Racial slurs written in public places and dormitories. Radical right-wing speakers on college campuses, and the lack of understanding of the differences between speech and hate speech has colleges and universities in difficult situations. Lastly, the increasing and rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is still largely being addressed by campuses with just campus statements, but no real tangible commitment to programming that towards prevention. Advocates are urging administrators to be in bouncing them, suggest that institutions have a plan in place when these occur. However, higher institutions are falling short in the areas of prevention. Too often, identifications of concerns take place after a violent engagement has already occurred. When this happens, it is uncommon for there to have been warning signs that went ignored, or where those who knew an individual simply did not know how to respond. The goal should be institutions to work towards prevention of engagement in violence by saving our young our young lives of our youth and young adults who feel compelled or pressured to engage in violent extremist ideology. I believe that the goal can be accomplished by identifying those risks, those who are at risk of violent radicalism, and providing them with wraparound services to ensure that their radical perspectives are engaged in a manner that is healthy for them, their families, their communities, and the entire society. I also believe that we should be focusing on educators because they have continuous structured opportunities to interact with youth, adults on a consistent basis. And given that youth and young adults are more vulnerable to be radicalized by radical extremist messaging and recruitment, it's essential that we focus interventions on those who engage most with youth who are at risk to participate in violent extremism. In closing, greater vigilance among teachers, counselors, administrators, professors, and other educators places more individuals in the prevention effort. And when I say prevention efforts, I am referring to actions which those engaged in normal educational processes can be aware of the potential risk factors and engage in interventions that result in healthy and positive outcomes. With further ado, I want to start off Dr. Aaron Bruce, who serves as Vice President for Diversity, for his remarks. And then after our rest of our panelists, we will get to the Q&A sessions. Dr. Bruce, the stage is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Let me start by sharing a statement that kind of sheds a little bit of light on the subject. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that's a quote from James Baldwin. You know, it's very easy to stand on the sidelines if you're not directly impacted by some of the hate crimes or hate speech or incidents related to discrimination or even sexism or homophobia or Islamophobia as well. And so we have to make sure that we're paying attention and as proactive as possible, like you've said. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that on college campuses, there are very high levels of fear and isolation. Even with us being online, there are still levels of student isolation that have existed prior and will continue to grow. And that connectivity is very important. There's a fear of genetic annihilation. There's a fear of the changing demographics. There's a fear of difference. There's a fear of retaliation if you were to speak out against whatever large group might be present and vocal. There's a fear of isolation. Students don't want to be alone. There's also a fear of the loss of racial hegemony that exists amongst many white supremacist groups. And there's a fear of non-white immigration. So, you know, we have to begin to be as proactive as possible. One of the things that we've been looking at Art Center is some of the myths and media influencers. As one of the top art and design schools in the country, we pay very close attention to media and how it influences culture, how it influences one's ideology. And we're noticing that in addition to the alt-right freedom of speech, the use of media, social media and different media platforms to spread hate and to spread myths of Black criminality, scientific racism, eugenic theories around racism. It's very important that we have a closer contact with students who hold these ideologies and create spaces for conversation. We know that there's freedom of speech in America, and this is one of the hot topics on many college campuses, but words do matter. Even related to some of the comments of our present president of the United States, there was an immediate reaction to some of his comments on college campuses and in communities related to bias incidents and hate. Over 900, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, took place. And it's very important that we as campus climate monitors, for lack of a better term, it's very important that we create spaces for students to be able to deconstruct media and messaging and to be able to think clearly about how messaging and media impact individuals. Media literacy needs to be woven in the curriculum in a more robust manner so that individuals feel like they have some power and that they feel like they can get a better understanding of how those media influencers are impacting college campuses. We're being incredibly proactive given the number of hate groups in California. It's very important that we're proactive in this work, which means that gathering not only with your campus police department or other student affairs officials, but also working very closely with student organizations that are primary targets, whether it's religious affiliated groups, clubs and organizations that are primary targets for these groups, and making sure that they know that the support is there for them. But at the other hand, we want to make sure that students who are vulnerable to recruitment from these hate groups have the support that they need and have a sense of belonging, and know that they're welcome in multicultural centers, and that they're welcome to explore whiteness. They're welcome to explore their identity, through the lens of their identity, in a way that's productive and helpful and proactive. A lot of times we on college campuses make the mistake of waiting until an incident occurs before we gather together as a community. And it really is very important always to connect with your diversity officers, connect with your multicultural centers, intercultural relations offices, and build structures and networks that are already prepared to come together and address those topics. We all know that these groups are looking for a spotlight, these hate groups, when they come to your campuses, and it's important to deny that spectacle. You know, and media coverage that heightens or amplifies their not necessarily thing. We want to make sure that you're providing alternate activities that take the spotlight away, positive alternate activities that take the spotlight away. It's important to put in place policies that address safety concerns that anyone might have around these topics, which means that you have to have a plan in place. This is not the time to be reactionary. In fact, our campus has been spending a lot of time even trying to monitor Zoom bombing and other potential influences that might come through the technical sphere, because we know that that's definitely a factor that a lot of us aren't up to speed on. I'll stop there. Great to see all of you, and I hope to hear more from our panelists.
Thank you, Aaron, for sharing your very important insights as a diversity officer. Now, I want to go to William, who's at the University of Maryland Start Center, one of the most reputable and important centers that deals with research when it comes to extremism and best practices. The stage is yours, William.
Thank you so much for having me. I should introduce the organization that I represent first. So as Mohammed said, I'm the director of START, which is a 15-year-old research center. We're a multidisciplinary research center, primarily utilizing the behavioral and social sciences. So we have criminologists and political scientists and sociologists and psychologists and geographers, et cetera, who all bring their theory and methods to bear on this very complex human and social phenomenon, terrorism, violent extremism. And one of the things that we've really tried to do is bring scientific methods to this very politicized and emotive topic, right? Terrorism and violent extremism is designed to get individuals, communities, institutions, and governments to react emotionally, and oftentimes to overreact or to react in ways that are actually counterproductive. And so one of the things we've done is we've generated a lot of data, objective longitudinal data sets on terrorist behaviors. And we've also really tried to study responses to terrorism and violent extremism, including many of the CVE responses that you heard Eric Rosand and others talk about earlier in the program. These are the non-law enforcement, non-military preventative programs and the rehab reintegration programs that happen on either side of some sort of act of criminality. Right? And one of the things we've been able to do as a research center that's based at a university is we've been able to bring our students directly into these conversations. And so I think the first takeaway is we would be, I think, misguided to think that we as professors or administrators have more insight or better answers than our student body does. So if we can inspire our students to a lifetime of public service, pushing back on violent extremism, whether as a public servant, official or in civil society, these are individuals who bring, tremendous amount of knowledge about their community, their demographic, their lived experiences. And so harnessing them has been a big part, I think, of our success. We've created the first, what I believe was the first CVE course in the country, called Innovation in Countering Violent Extremism. One of the critiques of CVE programs is that in order for them to be effective, they have to be really tailored to the local conditions, right? You can't, there's no one silver bullet solution to radicalization, to violence. You can't design it in Washington, D.C. and blanket it across the country and think it's going to work, right? We heard earlier from Cynthia and others talking about the diversity of far-right violent extremism in the United States. There's so many different flavors or permutations. And so we thought about that and said, okay, well, perhaps we can't scale this solution to violent extremism, but can we design a methodology, a problem-solving methodology, and then teach students that problem-solving methodology. So scale the educational process to allow students to come up with locally tailored solutions. And so we've designed this course and we use specifically design thinking or human-centered design. We teach the students this problem-solving methodology, which is really based on having empathy for the audience that you're designing for. So understanding the world through their eyes. So this might be the, understanding the world through the eyes of our immigrant population students on campus or our African-American students on campus. So we teach the students how to do empathy interviews with their community of interest, and then design products that will help that community solve the problems as they see them, as they understand them, not assuming our priorities, but letting the target population define its priorities. And that's been a really interesting process. We've then packaged that in online training, and we've done training for communities around the country using a similar methodology. But the students have been in the driver's seat. We've also engaged with a nationwide program called P2P, which perhaps Brett Steele talked about earlier. I missed her comments, but P2P is a program in which students take a semester-long course in which they get to design some kind of CVE program to push back on violent extremism. And at the University of Maryland, we've done this for many years, and our students have come up with fantastic programs. One of them decided to do exactly what Dr. Bruce just mentioned, is come up with empowering alternative programming. So instead of sort of pushing back on violent extremist ideologies, take the higher ground and celebrate the diversity of the student body at the University of Maryland. Proactively and positively celebrate the amazing richness that our immigrant students bring to our university body. And so create this alternative narrative program, which ideally starts to drown out the white supremacist motifs that you might otherwise find in circulating. Another program sought to educate the quote unquote bystanders, right? So the persons who might see a colleague or a friend or an acquaintance flirting with violent extremism, make an offhand remark that's racist in nature or that suggests violence. Teach them to take that as a very important thing, teach them what to do about that information once they come across it. And to design these programs, the students actually then built a video game called Operation Genovese to teach bystanders, how to react to these situations and empower them to be part of the solution. So again, embracing the students as part of the solution, I think, is critical. We've, in designing the training that we've brought around the country, we engaged very closely with our behavioral threat assessment or behavioral assessment teams on campus, and ideally tried to ensure that as they were thinking about their interdisciplinary intervention teams, that they also took violent extremist ideology and rhetoric very seriously, that they were aware of those warning signs so they could build it into their there are processes as a behavioral threat assessment team on campus that responds when a teacher or a student raises a concern. So those are some of the things that we've done to try to be part of the solution. I will just offer one other thought. Terrorism is a fairly off-putting topic. And most educators and universities aren't so interested in being securitized, right? They don't want to be seen as being deputized by the FBI to do counterterrorism investigations on campus. But universities care very much about violence prevention. They care very much about their student body. And I find that they care very much about hate and bias crimes. And I think this is an opportunity. It's a way into this conversation with universities. Hate and bias crimes are a massive issue in this country, right? So in a given year, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've had on average just over 60 terrorist attacks in the United States. We've had, in the last year of the FBI's hate crime data, 8,500 hate or bias incidents, right? And many of those are violent incidents. And so for whatever reason, when we talk about violent extremism, we focus on terrorism, which happens very, very infrequently. And we often exclude dialogue about hate and bias crimes, which happen at orders of magnitude more frequently, that affect our populations in very, very significant ways. And frankly, one of the reasons that in the national security space, we've made this separation is because terrorism is intended to have a psychological and a political impact on an audience beyond just the victim. And often hate crimes are not intended to have that psychological, political, or strategic impact. Often hate crimes are just acts of hate against the victims. But in today's day and age, with social media, 24-hour news cycles, and foreign influence operations amplifying all of the polarizing and violent issues that are occurring in our country, hate and bias crimes can have that same strategic impact as an act of terrorism. And so the differentiation between them is really less and less important. And so by focusing on hate and bias crimes, I think we can meet especially our students where they are, right? If you ask most of the students on the University of Maryland campus, if they're concerned about terrorism, they're going to say no. If you ask them about hate and bias crimes, they're going to say, yes, I'm very concerned about that. And so I think it's really important for us to bring hate and bias crimes much more into focus. That's not to say that they're not a focus of perhaps this community, the community that's self-selected in to care about these issues, but to university administrators who might not be paying strict attention to these issues, I think that's a way in. And just actually this week, last week and this week at START, we're releasing findings from a new data set on perpetrators of hate and bias crime. Sadly, in terms of research gaps, this is a first of its kind data set on the perpetrators of hate and bias crimes. Our representative data set has about 1,000 individuals who have engaged in both violent and nonviolent hate and bias crimes. And we're releasing analysis now about this population of offenders that ideally could be used to help inform and design preventative programming and also exit programming for this population. And so hopefully those resources will be useful for those on the talk today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William, for a lot of the amazing stuff that the START Center does. And I do know that many institutions and organizations that are engaged in this area of understanding countering violent extremism really depend on the research from there. So thank you so much on those efforts. Now I want to give the stage to Kelsey Greenberg Young, who serves as the Education Director at Anti-Defamation League San Diego.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I'm very happy to be here today. I always am so amused to join these conversations from such a different perspective than everybody else is coming from. Because as Mohammed shared, I'm the Education Director for the San Diego ADL, and I work primarily with K through 12 schools. And I'll back up a little bit and just make sure everybody knows who the ADL is and what we do in general, and then come at this topic from a little bit of a different perspective. For anybody who isn't super familiar, ADL is a 107-year-old anti-hate organization. And our mission has been the same from day one, which is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. Now, we're headquartered in New York, but we have 26 offices across the country and abroad, all working to fulfill that mission in a variety of ways. But the big ones fit right in here, which first, we do a lot of work in investigation. We monitor extremism across the ideological spectrum. We track hate and hate crimes both in person and online. And our Center on Extremism, as well as our regional operations teams, provide resources, expertise, trainings that support law enforcement, public officials, community leaders, and even technology companies to identify and counter these emerging threats. Now, besides our work in monitoring and investigating hate and hate crimes and extremism, we also work in advocacy. We work to remove obstacles to voting and uphold free speech, ensure religious freedom to all. And we fight for the equity and civil rights and justice for the Black community, LGBTQ community, women, immigrants, and any targeted community that is in need of that supports that part of our mission, right? To support the justice and fair treatment to all people. Now, the third big arm that we do, which if I admit my bias, is the most important, is our work in education. We work with students, young students, K through 12 students, and families and educators across the country on anti-bias education, hoping one day, obviously, to alleviate the need for those other two focuses we have and to alleviate a lot of the things that my co-panelists were talking about today. And although we have a variety of programs that we do this through, our big signature program that folks may have heard of is called No Place for Hate. It is a partnership and framework program for K through 12 schools to embed the work of challenging identity-based bullying and bias, and promoting respect, inclusion, and the honoring of diversity into the fiber of their school through active learning all year long. And we provide a variety of resources for them to do so, to support their schools in taking what they are already doing and elevating that under one unifying message that all identities must be safe and respected and belong on their school campus. Now, that work is augmented by our World of Difference anti-bias trainings, which focus on unpacking the complexity of identity, understanding the language of bias, and the systems of oppression that we are hopefully all talking about more and more today, as well as ultimately examining and then challenging bias in ourselves and in others. Which brings us back to the proactive idea that you mentioned, Mohammed, when we are talking about getting ahead of these very real threats that everyone here is talking about today. It starts earlier, it starts younger, and rather than waiting until these threats are being affected by young adults or adults in general, working at a young age proactively through somebody's entire school career is where I happen to work and believe that we need to be putting a big focus on today. I'm happy to expand on that more, but in general, that's where we're at.
Thank you, Kelsey, and all the amazing that you're actually engaged in the K-12. You're definitely making a positive impact. And I also had the opportunity to go on a trip with Kelsey to Germany. We actually looked at how the German society organizations are also dealing with this issues as well. So now we're going to get into a Q&A session. And I want to start off with this question to all of our panelists. So what impacts did the white nationalist march with torches at Charlottesville, Carolina, and the clashes that took place on campus? What impact did that have for campuses? Do you think that was a point or a wake-up call for many of these college campuses?
I can go first. I think it certainly was. The part of the phenomenon of the so-called alt-right. This is a reinterpretation of white supremacy in the United States that really was focused on mainstreaming itself by not flying below the radar, but dressing in a more clean-cut fashion, less neo-Nazi, more J. Crew, and this mainstreaming and rebranding meant, I think, that when all of a sudden you see this throwback to the KKK in a very visceral way, it was, I think, shocking for many who didn't sort of fully appreciate the alt-right as a threat to many. It was obviously very close to home for us as a Maryland institution, geographically. But I will say that we also had a white supremacist murder of an African-American student on our campus. It was a student who was visiting from a nearby campus, Bowie State. It was the week of this young man's graduation. He had just been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. And a student at the University of Maryland who is a member of a Facebook group called the Alt-Right murdered him. And this tragedy was, for us, obviously, hugely impactful. And we are trying to honor the legacy of Lieutenant Collins with new initiatives in collaboration with Bowie State to try to create a more inclusive and welcoming, student body and campus. And so, I think that what often happens is that these national events, the nationally televised events, happen, and when they echo the lived experiences of your more intimate community, when something happens, then all of a sudden the thing that's on the news channel becomes very real in a different way, and they amplify one another. So I think that's just been the experience for us.
Yeah, I think sometimes we, as administrators in general, overlook the emotional impact and the triggers associated with the consumption of that type of media for students. Just parents sending their kids off to college, there's fear of what could happen to the young one that you've raised and spent so much time and energy kind of grooming and cultivating them to be independent. And we don't realize the emotional impact until we actually see it and feel it. And when students come to you and they're unable to go to class because of consuming so much media that reflects hate, there's a fear of what could happen to that student, even just going to class. And one of the things that we've been paying attention to is the uptick in the number of African-American students attending historically Black colleges and universities, some predicated on the fact that I'm afraid to go to a predominantly white institution because I don't know what could happen. So because of these large national type displays of hate, many HBCUs have seen a significant uptick in the amount of applications and enrollment, which has a direct impact on the diversity of your campus. If you have a diverse campus which has a large number of white students as well, the decrease in African-American students is significant given the overall numbers of African-American students going to college. And so many parents are trying to make well-informed decisions about what is the level of safety, what is the level of support, and am I putting my young person in harm's way? I've noticed that over the past few years where parents are trying to make well-informed decisions and asking very significant questions of diversity officers around what is the campus really like? And students are doing more research, they're paying more attention to social media, and they want to see what we talked about earlier. They want to see that we're being proactive in our celebration of diversity and proactive in creating a sense of belonging for all the different types of students, international students, first generation students, DACA students or undocumented students, and what type of support do they have? And if they don't feel that it's there, then they don't attend. So it does have a significant impact on your diversity numbers. And not to mention just the overall wellness of students. We know the increase in number of students going to counseling or not being able to attend classes because they can't focus. These are all related to a lot of the social media and the triggers associated with consuming large amounts of hate speech, large amounts of media that really is messaging that you're not safe. You're not safe going to the store, you're not safe walking across your campus, and you may not even be safe in your own residence hall, depending on how the profile of the campus looks. And so it really is important for us to pay attention to how that media is being consumed and what type of programs and support mechanisms are in place, because it's not like they're going to go away anytime soon, which means that more resources, more professional development opportunities for not only administrators, but also faculty. And that's one of the things we're noticing as a result of this. We have to do more training. We just have to do more training and workshops and webinars and roundtable discussions so that our faculty are more prepared to address those concerns, even if it's just a microaggression in the classroom. Does the faculty member serve as a bystander, or are they actually saying, hey, you know what, that's not really appropriate, and maybe you want to say something like this? And what's the apology of action associated with your statement? If you are going to apologize, you've still inflicted harm upon someone. Is there apology of action that you might be able to work with that other student, your colleague, to address? And the same thing applies to some of coworkers and colleagues who have very significant perspectives around race and identity that could pose a threat to other colleagues or coworkers. So professional development isn't necessarily optional at this point. Our college has made it mandatory to get at least some baseline DEI training in addition to the other recommended concerns, and everyone has diversity, equity, and inclusion performance goals now. So it's not just the Office of DEI who now is responsible for that, or other specific offices. Everyone's responsible for creating a safe environment. And I think some of the things we've noticed related to these hate groups and their emergence in media is that it's everyone's responsibility to address these topics.
Mohammed, when you asked, what effect do we think Charlottesville had on these universities, or, in my experience on campuses in general, I do think it was a wake-up call for a lot of folks. Although we know that this has been out here forever, there was a realization perhaps with folks marching in the street with those signs and those torches that it is not hidden in the shadows the way it once was. And for me, that has really risen into a conversation about having these conversations about white supremacy, race, and again, the honoring of diversity much, much younger, and getting a little more buy-in in that than usual. We know that children are not born with prejudice. However, by early childhood, they have already acquired stereotypes, negative attitudes towards those they perceive as the other. And the majority of their brain is being developed, between 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, and that includes the development of racial attitudes, racial biases, which can even include the foundations of hate that we see in these adults marching in the street. So, my perspective and our perspective is that diversity and anti-bias education needs to be had and started at a very young age. And just like math or writing skills that students need in order to be successful when they head off to universities, to higher institutions, they are not a one and done skill. They are things that need to be honed and practiced throughout their entire career, and done in an age appropriate way. So, the work we do through No Place for Hate is about taking these conversations about bias and bigotry, privilege, white supremacy and racism, and all those manifestations of oppression and bias, and having those conversations be had starting from a really early age, K through 12, throughout in a child's entire career, rather than waiting for, say, when they're a sophomore in high school, that's when we have this conversation, or waiting until some sort of random maturity milestone, looking at how can we start having a conversation about race, about equity, about inclusion when they're 5, 6, 7, and how do we make sure that spans their entire K-12 trajectory? So that way, if students are to enroll in a college or university and they are likely in the most mixed group of identities they've ever been around, and they are the most vulnerable to be courted by these groups, these groups that are shrouding bigotry in a facade of fellowship and community and camaraderie and polo shirts, right? That if that student were to have gone their whole entire educational career in a school that embodied no place for hate values, schools that had anti-bias curriculum embedded throughout their entire life, that student would be much better suited to, one, see that hate for what it is, and value the benefits of diversity that a college campus offers, instead of being as vulnerable to be sucked in as they might be when they otherwise see that fellowship, that community, and that clean-cut polo shirt we saw marching with torches.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I want to ask this next question to Dr. Aaron Boots and William. Feel free to chime in as well. So question is, what impact does white supremacy literature, and I'm talking about flyers, stickers, slogans that are frequently being posted on college campuses, what effect do they have on students? Because oftentimes, by the time administrators figure out that these are polarizing, or hateful literature, I've seen the damage that has already been done. So, how can we make sure, as administrators and practitioners in this field of higher education, that college campuses don't become breeding grounds for violent right-wing extremist organizations?
It's interesting that you frame it in that way, Mohammed. That's one of those things that's been around since college campuses existed, is those types of inflammatory publications. Some people might say that they're more comical or just a joke of some sort. However, what we've noticed is it impacts everything on your college campus climate, because what you're doing is you're normalizing that type of behavior. And although there's freedom of speech, it has a direct impact on student recruitment. On many of the college campuses where I work, there's campus tours every day, if not twice a day or 3 times a day, where parents are walking through their campus and they'll see these images, they'll see this media, and it turns them away. And they ask very clearly, what are you doing about that? And so that's one point. But I don't want to overlook the fact that these groups have taken to the internet. And so you don't even see what's going on. Some of the incidents, not too long ago, there was an incident at a school where the noose was put up in a library, and there was a party announced online, a racist-based party that was posted on Facebook. And so we as administrators have to pay a lot more attention to what's going on in the digital sphere. And that's why it's good to be aligned with students, because they're constantly on that. And so having alignment with students, student organizations, graduate students who are involved in this type of work, it means that they will report it to us as quickly as possible and try to figure out what that digital footprint is, where it came from, so that we can address it as quickly as possible before it escalates to the point where someone's getting injured or students are being hurt, or it's tarnishing the brand of your institution in an incredibly negative way. It doesn't mean that particular group or those images or that media is generated by registered students either. And that's the thing to understand. I mean, these groups are targeting college campuses very strategically, and they're coming in waves. So how do you combat that? You have to be resilient. You have to understand the power that social media has, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, and not only using it as a recruitment tool, but using it as a hate tool to really destabilize your college campus climate. And I think one of the ways that Kelsey talked about, if students are coming into your college campus with a solid foundation of those important anti-racist skills, they will be good stewards of maintaining a healthy and inclusive campus climate. And they will educate each other. And what we're finding is that peer mentoring is incredibly valuable in that. If you have, a diverse group of peer mentors, white students included in that, who are able to help orient new students into that campus environment and climate and explain to them, this is how we act here. These are things we don't do here. It makes it a lot easier for administrators like myself to do our job. So that's kind of the take I have on it. Yes, we do need to figure out ways to combat, stickers and those types of things. And what we've done historically is we respond immediately as a task force, we sweep the entire campus and look for anything, whether it's even just scrawling in a bathroom stall that we're all familiar with. We address it immediately as if it was the most significant act, because if we don't address it, then it only escalates.
It's hard to add a lot to that. That was great. I think we have to remember that, we often fixate on violence. It's what captures our attention. And so when there's not a violent incident, we downplay it or potentially ignore it. And that actually means that we're failing to understand the essential nature of terrorism, violent extremism, which is to have a psychological and a political impact on an audience beyond the physical target of the attack, right? So violence is actually not necessary for all of the harm that's intended to be done. And so those symbols and that literature that achieves the psychological and political impact, existentially unsettling, I could only imagine, to feel that violence, the threat of violence is ever present, right? That's an insidious, harmful thing to inflict upon a community. And so to underestimate the importance of that, I think is missing the point about what this is really about. I did want to just also add regarding the idea of humor. So Dr. Bruce mentioned sometimes these things can be portrayed or dismissed as a joke. So extremists know this, and especially online, we're seeing the embrace, and we have seen the embrace of what researchers call meme culture. So creating these somewhat humorous, often very visually, very few words, mostly just a funny video. You imagine a screenshot of a comedic scene in a movie, but you overlay some harmful words on top of that comedic image. And it's very easy for this to be circulated widely. It sort of gets past our radar because it's presented under the guise of humor and pop culture. But underneath the surface, it's bringing people into the orbit of these violent extremist movements and narratives that are very much intended to generate harm. And so administrators, those should be highly aware that this is an intentional tactic by extremists to be able to spread their message more effectively with less censorship, and to reach audiences that they might not reach otherwise. Because they don't have to disseminate this only in the darkest quarters of the internet. They can disseminate this on Facebook and Instagram and kind of get away with it, right? So I think it's a really important point, and just wanted to highlight it.
Thank you. This next question is for Kelsey. It's sort of like a two-part question, but one, could you discuss a little bit more about the No Place for Hate initiative and how this, could assist us in higher education platforms? I understand a lot of your programming is focused on the K through 12. What are some of the success there, and could some of those success be transferred at a higher education setting?
Absolutely, Mohammed. Although, No Place for Hate is a K through 12 program, and it really does focus on this idea that these conversations should never stop. There's no starting point and there's really no ending point. They are continuous and they need to be engaged in actively. We work often across K through 12 districts or K through 8 districts. And the idea is that students need to be put into a place where they can not only practice the idea of challenging bias and prejudice, but that they can also be in conversations about examining what that looks like in their own lives every year forever. So again, not one and done. And although that is focused in K through 12, our anti-bias trainings that I mentioned, which focus on understanding those complexities of identity, marginalization, bias, and challenging bias out in the world, those do transfer over. we actually have a program called Hate Uncycled, which is specifically targeted at our university partners, in which we work with the universities to provide programs and resources to prepare administrators, faculty, staff, and student leaders, and even campus police on challenging bias in their institutions, right? Both on that individual level, like was mentioned by my co-panelists, right? Those moments of not being a bystander, that moments of peer-to-peer, of stepping up and saying something when you see something, but also looking at their larger institutions for what policies of equity or inclusion or what have you need to be revisited. And we also work with universities to respond to those incidents of bias, no matter how big or small. I really appreciated the fact that it was shared that even the smallest incident should be taken with the highest amount of importance, because if one thing slides, how much easier is it for the next thing to happen and the next thing to happen and the next thing to happen, right? If something becomes acceptable once, what about the next time? But we work with our partners to focus on responding to and preparing to those incidents of bias. And then we also work with universities to uphold free speech, right? And encourage this critical dialogue while upholding these values of inclusion. Because as opposed to, say, a K through 12 campus where you are able to put more rules and policies in place about what can and cannot be said, although there is a difference between free speech and hate speech, there actually isn't, right? Hate speech is free speech. And so what does it look like to balance on a public university campus, the ability to share what you want to share and what you can share legally, and also to, as a university, to stand up and speak up when something is being said that is hateful or being perpetuated by a hate group, or when these hate groups and extremist groups are rearing their ugly head through that guise of college-based programs, clubs, recruitment, flyers, etc. So back to, I guess, the original question is, I mean, we have programs for universities as well. And I think that knowing, I mean, at least in San Diego, we have a pretty, tight-knit community in a lot of ways here. So if you are working with the school districts that happen to feed in locally to you, whether or not it's the local K-12 district or it is your university, we know that they are microcosms of our community at large. So thinking about what is happening in our whole community and tackling these concepts from all different areas and ways has an effect on the entire community, period.
Thank you so much. You've touched upon a very important thing, I think, in terms of free speech that really, sets up for the next question. This is for Dr. Aaron Boots and also William. Let's talk about controversial speakers on campus. There are speakers that are anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, homophobic, just basically hateful speakers that are invited by sometimes the institution itself or student organizations. So how do we strike that balance between free speech and the cancel culture, which is a growing terminology in our national discourse? So how do you strike that balance?
That's an important question that a lot of colleges struggle with, partially because administration have differing points of view on the topic. If you ask legal counsel, where are the boundaries, that might be different from what the president of your college says or your university says. And also, historically, colleges have been a place for civil discourse. That's where challenging conversations have historically taken place. So like Kelsey's saying, you can't really stifle the opposing point of view. What you can do is lay groundwork for engagement. And that's really important so that everyone's safe, everyone's heard, and that any guest on your campus feels welcome, even if their point of view might be unwelcome, especially when it comes to controversial topics like Israel versus Palestine, for example. Very passionate opposing views. If the college were to take a side, then the college loses. And there are very passionate students on both sides of that topic. It's important for colleges to create safe spaces for dialogue. Now, you can be proactive in working with your campus security on protocol. And if you feel at any point, or you come to the determination that, you know what, the invitation of the speaker coming to our campus is going to cause an unnecessary financial hardship for our college, and therefore we're not going to be able to extend the invitation. That unfortunate financial hardship is a reality for many college campuses if you have to double or triple the number of campus police that you have there at that activity or event. So that's a reality. And you would pose the same policy on any group that presented an unnecessary financial challenge. I'm not saying that you're not inviting them, but you might have to postpone that visit until you can gain the resources or create a space that's going to be safe for every student. I think it's also important for our students to understand what it means that to have a conversation with someone that you don't agree with. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to outshout them. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything they say. Facts, information, I think those are all important points to bring to any dialogue. And we really want our students to develop those skills and understanding how to engage with difference. A lot of times we're afraid of what we don't understand. And that's why the history of homophobia has taken place on our campus or on campus communities. If you don't understand the LGBT community, well, then maybe you're going to be afraid of them. If you don't understand where the fear that some students who are part of this white supremacist movement, where that fear comes from, well, then we've really failed them as educators. So it really is important for us to create spaces inside the classroom and outside of the classroom for those important civil dialogues. And I think civility is a really important skill for any student to leave our campus and go into the world with. We don't want our students who graduate to go out there and get into fistfights with other people who have opposing views. And I think this is a time in our country where we're seeing a lot of times where imposing groups come together and there really isn't any civility there. It escalates to violence very quickly. But if you feel at any point, our number one responsibility as educators is to make sure all students are safe. And that means that we can't put students in harm's way. And if that means that we've set up policies that ensure that, then so be it. But I also think it's important to talk with the student organizations that are being used as sometimes pawns in this game, where they're being manipulated into bringing a speaker to campus when they don't fully understand the impact on their colleagues as campus members, or maybe even the impact on themselves and what they're representing. And so it's important to make sure they're well-informed student leaders in these organizations and that they can work together with other organizations on campus that might have opposing views to create open dialogue and a debrief before, during, and after so that everyone is safe. But private campuses are different from public campuses, but we're realizing that safety and the amount of resources necessary to ensure student safety may go well beyond the opportunity to bring a speaker to campus.
So Aaron, and William, I'll get to your thoughts on this as well, but where do you, as administrators, where do you draw the line? Isn't it just, clear that an individual is anti-Semitic and holds polarizing and dangerous ideologies? So regardless of financial a benefit or, or loss for the institutions, is there a lack of education for college presidents to basically say you're anti-Semitic and you're dangerous to be on our campus? So where do you draw the line? Should it be non-negotiable?
Colleges to draw the line, I really do. And I think some of that comes along the line of community practices, a value statement, an anti-racist value statement that, or a racial equity statement is what a lot of organizations are calling it now, that really establishes a firm set of values that demonstrate the campus's commitment holistically to stand in opposition to hate. By doing that, you're saying, you know what, our policies dictate that your narrative is in opposition to our values and therefore you are not welcome. And those are really powerful things to say because we want colleges to be spaces where opposing views can meet. But if that's the line and you've established those values, and it could be that, you know what, we do not fund organizations that uphold racist or hateful values. And if your ideologies don't fall in sync with that, well, then you're not welcome. And it's easy for students to make that decision when they're applying to a school. They're like, oh, this school has some very clear anti-racist statements that say we're not going to tolerate that. I feel comfortable applying to this school. I feel comfortable attending this school because I feel like the institution has already supported me. and my safety. But these are new things and new ideologies that haven't existed. I mean, you might have an affirmative action statement at the bottom of an application somewhere, but there's nothing holistically that says these are the values that are firmly planted in our college, and any activity that goes against those values are going to be questioned and addressed immediately. So I think more college campuses are beginning to say, no, we don't get to stand on the sidelines anymore. And it's a new generation of collegiate leaders who are beginning to say, no, you know what? This is how I feel about it personally as a professional. I wouldn't want my child to be in harm's way. And it goes against the values that this college stands on. And it even comes to a point where, would you, in your supplier diversity initiatives, would you support a business, a construction company that had a racist ideology? No, you probably wouldn't. So why would you do that with a speaker? So it's beginning to look more at the economic component as well. And I think it does mean there is more training in terms of how senior administrators lead through a diversity lens or diversity, equity, inclusion lens. And so our executive cabinet is going through some professional development right now related to that, because we want to make sure that they're ahead of the curve and that they're modeling the behavior we want our deans as well as our other administrators to adopt and embrace. And it's part of the interview process as well.
Wonderful. William, have a question for you. What are the research gaps when it comes to to understanding extremism in higher education? I understand there's so much publications out there understanding countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, whatever you call it, but is there a gap in research on what colleges and universities can do and what type of programs they can create that could have impact around these issues?
Sure. I think that there's probably a lack of a body of research on measurement and evaluation of violence prevention programs on university campuses. It's not to say that it would be no available research, but it'd be really useful to be able to, in a very disciplined and intentional way, look at different theories of change that are different program models that are being used on different campuses, and try to understand which ones are being more effective in what circumstances or contexts, and then sharing that information deliberately to other university administrators. Universities have finite financial resources. If they're fortunate enough to have the resources to have a behavioral assessment team, that doesn't mean they have the resources to do measurement and evaluation, third-party measurement and evaluation. And so obviously universities often have the human capital under their payrolls to do measurement and evaluation. And so I think there are ways to do it, but I think that would be really useful from a very pragmatic point of view. And then I would also, in this country, earlier Eric Roseanne mentioned tertiary prevention, which is really rehab and reintegration. We are really, really not ahead of the power curve on rehab and reintegration when it comes to violent extremism. One of the big obstacles from START's research agenda to extremist disengagement, de-radicalization, and desistance from extremism it's their inability to successfully move on, right? By either getting a good job, getting a good education. It's hard for these individuals to get into universities or to get into good employment situations because they struggle to leave this thing behind them. And so universities could really serve as a tremendous tool for rehabilitation and reintegration. And being more intentional about that, I think, is an area where universities could play a very pragmatic and meaningful role. However, that's risky business for a university to say, we're going to help get people who have this in their rearview mirror successfully reintegrated into society, right? That's a risk that they would have to take, but it would be valuable, frankly. And if we don't invest in rehab reintegration, we're actually, it's illogical, right? That means we're not investing in risk mitigation, because rehab and reintegration is good risk mitigation. So I think those are two areas.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me. I just wanted to add on to what William was saying, because I think it's important to think about you know, a lot of times we think about students of color in these situations or historically marginalized communities, and we think about the pain they're going through. And as a CDO, I'm constantly checking my positionality in this work and helping our campus community to understand that, okay, well, white students are experiencing this as well. There's a phenomenon that white students are experiencing related to seeing something that represents their ideology or their identity act in a way that doesn't fall in sync with their beliefs. And they're saying, wow, there's white people who are hateful out there, and that's not who I am. How do I express that to people? How do I present myself as an ally? What do I need to do to feel better about my whiteness? You know, and because there's some guilt that comes into play, and there's a confusion about whether or not they can even be part of some of these movements or some of these struggles. So it's important that we address, you know, the conversation and create spaces for white students to begin to unpack whatever they're experiencing, because it's confusing, right? I mean, you're thinking like, well, my parents didn't raise me to like run around with tiki torches and say hateful things. Why are other people doing that? And why are they representing my identity in that way? And why am I experiencing a backlash from that? Even where some people's roommates don't want to talk to them anymore, or you know, or maybe people don't want to date them who were dating them at the time. So it's important to create spaces where we don't marginalize white people in this as a community, right? Because what we're noticing about a lot of the movements we're seeing today from young people is that they're very unified, they're very diverse, and white people are part of these movements to address the atrocities that have impacted white people, Black people for decades. So, you know, it's interesting to think about the role that college campuses will play in educating, and a lot of the folks that work with ADL are amazing professionals, and a lot of the students who get that training are white students, and we want to make sure that there's more spaces for them to understand that, like, yeah, you know, that doesn't represent me, but we're realizing that we're not doing that type of programming in diversity centers, right? I mean, white students may not always feel comfortable to just walk into those multicultural spaces. So we want to make sure that we're opening our doors up a little bit wider on college campuses and helping facilitate conversations that are supporting the questions that a lot of our students are having, and maybe even some of our white faculty and staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. We just have a few more questions. I know we're against time as well, but this is for Kelsey. You know, as you know, you're working K through 12 setting. I know there's a lot of a teacher involvement, a lot of parent involvement as well. Have you received any pushback from educators or parents or staff on some of the initiatives that you're working?
You know, the most common pushback I get, Mohammed, is that adults don't like the word hate. They fear that by introducing the word hate into a school, somehow they are introducing the concept for the very first time to kids. By saying it, all of a sudden it's going to make it a thing. And perhaps by using that word or taking on one of these programs, they are admitting that there is a problem. And my answer to that is always the same. You know, No Place for Hate is about focusing on the positive behaviors to address prejudice, bullying, and bias. Like Aaron said, it's about creating those allies, right? Getting people to stand up and use their privilege to undo the mess that we're in and have been in for hundreds of years, right? To take that step and initiative to make that positive change or to maintain a positive environment, right? Maybe something is going very well, and that is fine. But if we are going to actually empower kids or adults to effectively make that change that we want to see, we have to examine the fact that hate and bias exist in an age-appropriate way in our world. And, you know, by becoming a No Place for Hate school, an individual school is not saying that they have a specific problem, but rather they have to honestly admit that societally, hate does exist. Societally, bias exists. Societally, oppression is a real problem, and systemic discrimination against people of color, against the LGBTQ community, against immigrants, against women, etc., is a problem. And that in their school, it's not going to get left unchecked, right? They are going to put forth that value, those values, that mission statement, and say, no, not here. And we just talk about the fact that pretending that hate is not out there, that our kids are completely somehow untouched by it. It doesn't help anyone. But what does help is by being proactive and empowering agents of change to recognize bias when they see it, challenge it as active players in the work of making a just society, and just trusting in the fact that kids can understand a lot more and have a much bigger impact than adults tend to give them credit for.
Thank you. Just two questions. This is for Dr. Aaron Bruce, if you want to chime in. Where do faculty play in the role of combating extremism? So should there be areas of training or engagement? Because, you know, our faculty play a key role on our campus as they're shaping the minds of our students. So what should be faculty involvement around these issues?
I think the baseline would be inclusive curriculum design. We want to make sure that the learning experience is inclusive and there's appropriate representation of all different types of perspectives and ideologies. And we spend a lot of time doing that at a design school because we actually are designing for the entire world. And you might be working with a diverse team of individuals or serving a diverse group of clients or customers. And that includes whether you're making a film or whether you're designing a video game. We want to make sure that there's even gender neutral characters in their video game, right? So we're spending a lot more time in the classroom, making sure that faculty have the professional development so they're confident with what inclusive curriculum design means, whether it's working with people with varying abilities or disabilities. We want to make sure that every student has a sense of belonging in the learning experience. By modeling that behavior, they will take that understanding into the workforce. So it actually has an exponential impact on our society. Not everyone comes into the teaching profession with the same background, or especially in higher ed. Many of them are working professionals who are teaching part-time. And so we want to make sure that they all have some knowledge. So it's a constant upgrade on what can we do to support them in developing their curriculum. And we're monitoring that. We're evaluating even the language that's in their syllabus. A lot of times a statement of inclusion in a syllabus sets the tone that, hey, hateful speech isn't tolerated here. We've already established that as a ground rule for our time together. Let's adhere to that. And if you need a reminder as a faculty member, I can remind you that in our syllabus, it says these things, and reading that with the group together so it's not skimmed over is really valuable in setting a tone where every student feels valued. We're even going as far as to do things like generate our own pronoun identities and asking students to identify themselves. And online, we're doing that as well, so that if you're in a space and you don't know someone's gender, it's in their little name tag under their Zoom name. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the digital realm that are opening up doors, bringing in guest speakers into the classroom so that there's appropriate representation outside of your own identity. Even if that's gender equity, we want to make sure that individuals in the classroom feel like, okay, I get it, I'm getting multiple perspectives, and also bringing in opposing points of view that go against what you might think is the norm. And we're finding that's really important when faculty have a particular lived experience in industry, and it may not fall in sync with what some of our young designers or creative minds are thinking. So that's really where it starts. And I think that it's not something that can be overlooked. It's a prerequisite right now. You can't go into the classroom and teach unless you've had some baseline DEI work. But what's nice is that you have to have some additional professional development throughout your career that changes constantly. And a part of our responsibility is to work with our academic council and our provost to make sure that what's current and what's necessary are being addressed as quickly as possible. And creating spaces for students to give feedback. You know, at the end of a class, you'll get feedback from a student. It's kind of like a course evaluation. What we're trying to do is build that into the learning experience. You can check in with students and ask them throughout the learning experience, what would make this experience better for you? Are there things that you're looking to learn that aren't on the syllabus that we could add at some point? And I think students appreciate being part of the learning experience and infusing what they're interested in learning about. And that makes for a better learning experience. And it also gives a student opportunity to teach from the lens of their perspective, and they get to be the facilitator of the learning experience as well. That's incredibly validating. And it also is a great way to teach other students about what leadership is, which is something that we want to do. We want to develop inclusive leaders.
Thank you very much. And last question. This is for all of our panelists. So what just last pointers, just in a very short, concise response, what can educational campuses do to brace for impact after election when it comes to the rise of hate?
It's a great question. So I think hopefully, campuses have been setting the tone, as Dr. Bruce was discussing earlier, modeling good behavior. Universities are a place to have difficult discussions, to hear opposing points of view, to debate, to engage in civil discourse. And hopefully that will bear fruit in a very difficult time, or a potentially very difficult time over the next few weeks. It's very hard, as I think was mentioned earlier, to do damage control or crisis control if you haven't built the foundations of trust and dialogue ahead of time, right? And so it's never too early to start, but it can be too late in certain instances. I know that our university has sent notes out over the last few weeks saying, we should be prepared for difficult conversations in the classroom. Here are some strategies to deal with inappropriate conversations, but all, that maybe a student might initiate, but also appropriate ways to have that conversation or have conversations about these difficult issues. And, it might seem a little patronizing, but it's useful. It's really useful to get a short email from an informed colleague and an informed administrator that says, here are a few simple strategies that can help you have this conversation. I really benefit from them. I'm not a professional educator in the sense of dealing with these issues, right? I have some training and I've really benefited from the workshops that I've gotten from the university, preparing me to be a better educator in terms of diversity and inclusion and these conversations. That training, I think, will probably serve me very well in the next few weeks. But I love the prompts from the university that remind me of some of those best practices.
Yeah, what can you say? This is an interesting time in our country, and it's almost the same thing. How do communities brace themselves for the impact of what we're on the verge of? I think it's important to align yourself with all different types of people in your community prior. Some people don't even know their own neighbors. And so I think that's important. So creating spaces for dialogue is going to be more challenging because a lot of us are online. And so we have to be very intentional about creating those spaces and understanding that some people don't want to have a dialogue, but the invitation to small group discussions has a lot of impact. It also helps in healing. We know that a lot of individuals are going through incredible amounts of pain. Some of our colleagues are going through a lot of pain, and the stressors are significant. I would say make sure that you have individuals who can help facilitate those discussions available. It's not a one and done. Small group discussions are probably better than large town hall meetings with 400 participants. Also understanding there are multiple forms of media expression. So it might be a Zoom call, it might be an email, it might be a chat stream that goes on, it might be some creative activity that individuals adopt to just say, hey, I just want to make a poster. And so because we're in a creative space, we're thinking about creative forms of expression to get out whatever challenges are inside. Some people, it might just be a one-on-one conversation with another administrator or with a counseling center. We need to do more of that. This isn't something that we can internalize, and we realize that young people want to have a voice, and whether we create the space for them or not, they will find Instagram or some other platform to express whatever they want to express. It's great if we can help manage that a little bit and give them the tools to be able to express that in the most appropriate manner without hurting themselves and their digital footprint, whatever that might be. I'm hopeful that our country is going to be able to heal from whatever challenges we've experienced over the past year, basically, and realizing that we're not alone in this. There are many individuals connecting to community-based organizations is also a plus. You don't have to do it in isolation on your college. You can partner with any organization that has been doing this work for decades, like ADL. You can partner with community groups that are already having these conversations. I think that's really important, is to understand that the reach and the impact of your college campus goes beyond the campus proper. And your alumni associations, your different community groups, your fraternities and sororities, and all these different affiliates that also support what you're doing. I think those are great first steps. And even just pinging them and sending out and say, hey, we may be in touch with you. What are your plans as community-based partners can be really valuable in this work, because there's experts in this, and no one's saying that we have to reinvent the wheel this time.
Mohammed, I think that we all need to be prepared for a really large uptick in incidents of bias, no matter what happens next week or the week after, or however long that's going to take, unfortunately. And I think something to keep in mind right now is the fact that when we hear hateful speech or hateful speech happens, that counter speech, productive and respectful and inclusion and speech that is inclusive and validating and uplifting of all our communities should be louder. Right? Our counter speech should be louder. And so, at ADL, we talk about how we're not a political organization, we're nonpartisan, but however, we are principled. And so if no matter what side of the aisle things fall, no matter which group is the one saying things that they should not be saying, we can't let incidents of bias go. We have to speak up, and we have to speak up loudly. And I would ask that universities be ready to put out statements should the incidents that I fear will happen in solidarity and recommitting to the values that the university stands for, to make sure that all of their communities are feeling safe. Because a lot of people come the next 2 weeks are really not going to be feeling safe.
Thank you so much. Well, there you go, everyone. I want to thank all of our panelists today, Kelsey, William, and Dr. Bruce, for taking time out of their busy schedule to joining us for this very important discussion. We thank you so much. All of your remarks and insights and expertise are very valuable as we, as a nation, come together to bring solutions to violent extremism. So thank you so much. Appreciate it. And momentarily, we will be going to our last panel discussion. So just to give us a few minutes as we transition to our next panel discussion.